Once again this week, we're joined on Skype by Dr. Matthew Potter, curator of Limerick Museum. Matt, you're very welcome and it's lovely to see you again.
Thank you.
One of these days we might even get to sit in the same room, wouldn't that be?
It'd be some achievement, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, really and truly, it would. Listen, I suppose today what we've decided to do is to look at the first part of a number of sports grounds and how they came about. We all take them very much for granted, I suppose, now in today's world. And of course, a lot of talk going on at the moment about the opening up of sports grounds and you know that you still have to maintain the sports grounds, even though obviously that nobody will be able to play in them for so long. But sports grounds, I suppose, have evolved over a period of time, and no more than we've spoken quite a bit about Marketsfield, and it probably merits a programme all of its own at some point. So we'll set that aside in the current climate, albeit with a few mentions maybe along the way. But we're going to look today at two particular sports and sporting grounds, and they've added an awful lot to Limerick, but they were of their time, and a lot of people would drive past them or walk past them now and not know that there was ever the level of history in them that there actually was. So we'll start off and we'll have a look at the whole turf wars, as they would say, the turf racing and the development of racing in Limerick and the various grounds and the various people that were involved in it and how it evolved over that period of time. Of course, racing has been in the psyche for many, many generations.
That's right. That's right. I mean, horse racing has been around since the time of the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Greeks and the Romans, but modern horse racing, organized in a manner recognizable to the contemporary racecourse, only developed really in the late 17th, 18th century. King Charles II of England was a great fan of horse racing, and he made Newmarket the centre of horse racing. And rules and regulations then were gradually brought into existence. And then in the middle of the 18th century, in 1750, the Jockey Club was established in England to govern horse racing. And in Ireland, a mere 5 years later, in 1755, the Jockey Club in Ireland was also organised. And Limerick, of course, was involved in the horse racing industry in Ireland from the very beginning. Again, there was a long tradition of, I suppose, what one might call informal horse racing in the Limerick region. But it wasn't really until, again, the middle of the 18th century, with the establishment of the Jockey Club in Ireland, that horse racing took on an organised form in Limerick. And while most of us are familiar with Green Park Racecourse in Ballinacurra as having been the home of Limerick racing for 130 years, before that, it was Newcastle in Castletroy that was the home of Limerick racing for about, it is thought, around 100 years, from the middle of the 18th century until 1868.
A very interesting place and probably more famous now, and we drive past it every day, as the home of Castletroy Golf Club.
That's right. There was what was described by many contemporary observers as a natural amphitheatre there. You had Blackguard Hill, which acted as a sort of a grandstand, and then you had the large area beneath that, which acted as the racecourse. And of course, many cynical observers have noticed that Blackguard Hill was very well named because the races in Newcastle were notorious for their unruly behaviour, for the presence of faction fighters, for the presence of dubious con men, for the activities of shady turf accountants, crooked jockeys and horse dealers and horse owners. And it was very much of its time insofar as, you know, the much more organised form that sports have taken on in the last 150 years or so. That wouldn't have been the same in the 18th and 19th centuries. So that, for example, even though Newcastle Racecourse was patronised by the gentry and it was one of the most fashionable events to attend the races there, nevertheless, there was also then a much more proletarian aspect to it, where there was a great deal of drunkenness, fighting. Indeed, as late as 1865, it is recorded that 6 people actually died at the races. And I quote here from Sean Spellacy's fine book on the history of Limerick. He says, In 1865, 6 people died. One, the wife of James Nash, died of shock on hearing that her servant Bridget Roach had fallen into a quarry after drinking bad whisky at the races. George Ballard fell off a jaunting car into the path of another at Pennywell on his way home, and he died. Another unidentified man died in a similar accident on the same day, coming home from the races drunk. J. Hilliard was on his way to the races to beg when he was struck and killed by a jaunting car in Pennywell, and a fireman named Sullivan with the Limerick Steamship Company was found dead of alcohol poisoning the day after the races. End of quote. So you can see that there was a lot more disorder in the Limerick races in Newcastle than there ever were to be again, either in Green Park or subsequently in Greenmount.
A fascinating snapshot of history, and you can just imagine, and just reading the contemporary accounts of people streaming out from the city to go to these races. The other thing that really struck me about this, Matt, was that it didn't seem to be, where racing is sometimes now thought to be the gift of the more upper classes. It was very much accepted as being something that everybody got involved in, and hence Blackguard Hill, which, by the way, for those that might be interested, is probably now the hill that, as just before you come to the Hurlers pub on the left hand side of the road, there's an elevated piece of ground just up there. That would be Blackguard Hill, and of course the roads would have been slightly differently laid out at that point as well, but of course the Hill of Monaleen being famous as well around that time. So it really was, from a geographical point of view, I suppose, an awful lot different to what we would know today as well.
Well, the point you made about the wide social cross section that attended the races is a very valid one. It was actually very similar to politics at that period, in that the gentry controlled it and actually monopolized all of the positions of authority, but the ordinary population also got involved and played an active role in politics. The main role of the masses was to form mobs often and attack the supporters of the opposing candidate and so on. And the races were no different. It was strange that there was actually both strict social segregation among the classes, but also there was a certain amount of mixing among the classes, and that would have been the case in many aspects of society before the 19th century. The 19th century saw a much more rigid demarcation between the public spheres of different classes of society, and even where different sports then tended to be played by different sections of the population. I should actually at this point also, of course, point out that Newcastle didn't have a monopoly of racing in the late 18th, early 19th century. There were racecourses. I suppose racecourses might be a too formal term for them. Racing was held in different parts of County Limerick, in places like Croom, in Buff, in Rathkeil, in Newcastle West, in Lemonfield as well. And in many cases it would have been just simply a large green area where horses could run, and where there was also facilities for members of the public to actually observe the race.
That great local historian out around Croom, John Fitzgerald, tells me that his house is pretty much built on where the racecourse in Croom was, and it's not a million miles away from where the new racecourse now sits as well in Patrickswell. So that's quite interesting, that the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's right.
By 1860, the mid 1860s, the poor landowner was getting a little bit cheesed at all of these faction fights and drunkards and licentiousness that was going on, and he called a halt to it all, the final meeting being on the 14th of October in 1868.
That's correct. You see, as I mentioned already, certainly from the beginning of the 19th century, but more particularly as the century advanced, there was a growing sense of outrage at the drunkenness, the unruliness, the faction fights, not only obviously at Newcastle races, but in Irish society in general. And there was a much greater emphasis on respectability, on behaving properly. You had the temperance movement, you had the expansion of the middle classes. So what would have been considered acceptable behaviour in 1800 had become very unacceptable behaviour by 1900. And as you mentioned, the owners of Green Park, of Newcastle, terminated the races out there because of their annoyance at what had become at this stage unacceptable public disorder. So then in 1868, the races moved to Green Park. But even there initially was not such an improvement because, again, I'm quoting here from the Limerick Chronicle of the 15th of October 1868, shortly after the start of the horse races at Ballinacurra, a faction fight took place near the entrance to the course in the vicinity of what is known as the Water Leap. So just simply moving Newcastle to Ballinacurra didn't put an end to the disorder, but with the passage of time then, and indeed the church course the churches would have had a role here as well in forcing their followers to behave in a much more civilized fashion, so that by the end of the 19th century, the races in Green Park had become a much more seemly affair, much more decorous. And I'd say this was helped to some degree as well by the building of the grandstand there in 1893. That, of course, would have created social distancing, to use a modern term, a very contemporary term, between the elite and the less elite racegoers. And there was a company then established, of course, to run the races at Green Park. And Sir Charles Barrington of Glenstall, whom we've spoken of in earlier podcasts in relation to the development of rugby in Limerick, he was at the head of this company and played a major role for a number of years in promoting racing in Limerick and in particular at Green Park.
We need to go back, I suppose, to go forward a little bit here. And, Charles Barrington, the mention of the name Charles Barrington, the same names come up time and time again. And right. the land that Green Park was built on, of course, was originally owned by the Hogans. I'm seeing Mrs. Burns, Mrs. Dawson, yes, and Mrs. Stokes. Now, I presume that's a wife or a relation of our friend William Lamb.
I understand that it is a relative. I haven't yet discovered if it's if it's his wife or if it's a close relation. Seeing as Lamb Stokes was born in 1851 and this was 1868, it could very well be his mother or his aunt or somebody of that particular generation.
Okay. Anyway, just to move it forward, and you talk about the church getting involved. Obviously, racing went on for so long, but I suppose the two main events that Green Park will be remembered for forevermore will be around June in 1963, and again at the start of October, end of September, start of October in 1979. The visit of John F. Kennedy and the most wonderful speech made by any Limerick politician ever, in my book, with Francis Condell's great welcome to John F. Kennedy, and also, of course, then the visit of Pope John Paul II, which was an immense event in the history of Limerick as well.
That's right. Well, the interesting thing about John F. Kennedy's visit to Limerick in 1963 was that initially it wasn't scheduled at all to happen, because John F. Kennedy had visited Europe in June of 1963, during which he made his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech in Berlin. And he was showing solidarity there, of course, to the people of West Berlin 2 years after the Berlin Wall had been built. But he was, of course, due to make a scheduled stop in Ireland on his way back to the US. But he wasn't going to be, initially, Limerick wasn't part of his itinerary at all, until Mrs. Condell, then the mayor of Limerick, Frances Condell. She was the first ever female mayor of Limerick, of course. And she lobbied the American ambassador in Dublin, and she lobbied the Irish authorities, the Irish government, until eventually she was successful in persuading the American government to schedule Kennedy's visit to Limerick, which only lasts for half an hour. It's actually ironic when one thinks of it that it's become such an iconic event, but Kennedy was only in Limerick for about half an hour. He arrived in Shannon. He came in from Shannon Airport. He went into Green Park, where he was welcomed by Mrs. Condell in the speech, which you rightly described as one of the most eloquent ever made by an Irish politician. And Kennedy himself, no mean orator, said it was the finest speech he had heard on his trip to Europe on this occasion. And he was then given the honorary freedom of Limerick at a specially convened meeting of the Limerick City Council in Green Park. And then he was whisked back out to Shannon. So it all happened in an amazingly short time. A mere half hour, but in that half hour, he left an indelible mark on the Limerick folk memory.
And of course, his own famous speech had that wonderful quote in it that Limerick being famous for fast horses and beautiful women,
Right.
which is oft misquoted.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right.
But a wonderful memory, and a great memory that has stood out in the memories of anybody that was there on that day. And of course, then fast forward to 1979 and the visit of Pope John Paul II as well, under the under the guardianship of Bishop Jeremiah Newman at that stage.
Correct. Well, that was scheduled from the start. All right, that Limerick should be part of the Pope's itinerary, and the number that attended that mass is estimated to be around 400,000, and that would be the largest gathering of people ever in the history of Limerick. It would be rivaled by Daniel O'Connell's monster meeting in Limerick in 1843, which was attended by about 250,000. And then, of course, the visit of the Granny to Limerick in 2014, when there was a similar number, about 260,000, I think. And but the Pope's visit attracted a greater number than either of them. And I suppose you could argue it was probably the high point in the history of Green Park, because Green Park remained Limerick's racecourse until 1999, when it closed down. So for 130 years, it was at the centre of the public life of Limerick.
And of course, the home of the Limerick Show as well for that period of time.
Yes. The Limerick Show, of course, had existed in the 19th century, had gone into abeyance then at the time of the First World War, and was revived in 1929. And last year, of course, it marked its 90th year of continuous existence. And ironically, it's not actually happening this year, but that's a different thing. Obviously, it's a public emergency, whereas it had ceased to exist for a number of years in the teens and 20s before being revived in 1929.
So I suppose that's a look at that. And of course, after 1999, then it would have moved out to the to the County Limerick, and since then it has been established in a beautiful new racecourse and facility out there in Patrickswell.
That's right.
Where history is being made as we speak.
As we speak, exactly.
Okay, let's move on, Matt. That's the racing and all of that, and I know there's other point-to-points have been held all over the place as well that we could certainly do a complete program on those. So. But another intriguing, and I suppose this has only come to my own attention in the last little while, Limerick Lawn Tennis Club. As you drive out from the city and you go through the leafy Ennis Road and you come out to the Union Cross and you just go beyond it on the right-hand side, some people may not even know it's there. Limerick Lawn Tennis Club is based in there, but it has a fascinating history, Matt.
It has. It was originally the Limerick County Cricket Club. And again, we're looking at an aspect of Limerick's sporting past and Ireland's sporting past that has only recently been restored to public memory. And again, we're indebted to that wonderful Limerick sports historian, Tom Hayes. He has written about the development of cricket in Limerick. Again, to give a global picture, cricket had been around as a sort of a popular sport, a kind of a folk sport in England for centuries. But like so many other sports, only took on an organised form in the late 18th, early 19th century, and with the establishment of Marylebone Cricket Club, and then the construction of the Lord's Cricket Ground, and then there was rules drawn up, and it became an organised sport. And of course, it also then spread to Ireland very quickly as well. And Tom Hayes tells us that actually the earliest cricket club in County Limerick that's known of at the moment was Stoneville Cricket Club in Rathkeale. And in fact, Rathkeale was, Tom tells us that Rathkeale was a pioneering area for sports in the 19th century, that the first rugby club was established there. The first Limerick Rugby Club was established in Rathkeale. First cricket club. But the cricket club in Rathkeale then, of course, would have been to some degree overshadowed by the Limerick County Cricket Club. There have been various attempts made to establish a cricket club in Limerick, and there were very many ephemeral cricket clubs, even one, would you believe, in my own native Clarina. But the Limerick County Cricket Club was established in 1871. And even when it was established, there was some public commentary that, at last a club has been established that we hope will continue to exist. And so it did. So it's the progress of cricket, or the history of cricket in Limerick, of course, to some degree paralleled the history of cricket in Ireland, that it enjoyed some considerable popularity in the mid to late 19th century. Then, of course, became associated with the ascendancy, with British rule, and became associated with everything that, say, the GA was opposed to. So that as the GA rose then in the 1880s and 1890s, cricket declined, and the Limerick Cricket Club eventually folded. Of course, there is now a new Limerick Cricket Club. When I say new, it was established in 1968 and it's based in Adair. So the cricket tradition in Limerick, then in between the demise of the Limerick County Cricket Club and the current Limerick Cricket Club, was kept up to a large extent by the LPYMA, the Limerick Protestant Young Men's Association. They had cricket as one of their main sports. But going back to the Limerick County Cricket Club on the Ennis Road, while it went into decline, it actually spawned another sport, which then initially was only a sideline to its main activity, and which then became the mainstay of the club, and that was, of course, lawn tennis. Because in 1875, lawn tennis was introduced into the Limerick Cricket Club, and with the passing years, it became the dominant sport. So now, of course, it's now known as the Limerick Lawn Tennis Club, and its past history as a cricket club has been largely forgotten.
And it's to go back to that. I mean, the growth of the Limerick Lawn Tennis Club as we know it now very much mirrored what happened in Wimbledon as well. I mean, we were very much on a par with them in terms of competition, and even in the profile of players that came in the early years. That's
right. Ireland was quite prominent in lawn tennis at the outset of the organised modern game, and Limerick then within Ireland was also quite popular. So, for example, you have the famous or infamous character Vir Thomas St. Ledger Gould, a wonderfully named character who actually, in 1879, he became the third ever Wimbledon champion. Now, he was born in Clonmel in County Tipperary, and he won the he rose to prominence in cricket, in tennis in Ireland. But then, as I say, went on to win the Wimbledon Championship in 1879. Don't forget that the Wimbledon Championship was only established in 1877. There was an Irish connection to the first winner as well. A gentleman called Spencer Gore was the first winner of Wimbledon in 1877, the men's singles. And his family were major landowners in County Donegal and in County Mayo, the Earls of Arran. And actually, ironically, both Spencer Gore and Vir Thomas St. Ledger Gould came to a sticky end. Poor old Gore ended up going broke, and then our friend Vir Thomas St. Ledger Gould had a sort of a life straight out of either a Victorian melodrama or a modern soap opera, in that he took off to Monte Carlo with his French wife, and he attempted to break the bank in Monte Carlo, and when he was unsuccessful at the roulette table, he murdered her, and was then shipped off then by the French to Devil's Island, to their notorious penal colony, where he committed suicide in 1909. But I think, he merits a programme on his own, really. I don't think that this brief mention of him is doing him justice at all.
Absolutely not. And amazingly, look, and I know that they hold competitions there every year in the Limerick Lawn Tennis Club, and it has very much become accepted as part of Limerick life at this stage. But ironically, it was a third sport that has probably given it the most prominence, and that was rugby. And up to very, very recently, it was the only ground in Limerick that had hosted a rugby international, a full rugby international.
That is correct. On the 19th of March 1898, a rugby international was played in what was then the Limerick County Cricket Grounds between Ireland and Wales. And the game was it was won by the Welsh, but it attracted a great deal of attention, and it was reported at some length in the Munster News and the Limerick and Clare Advocate of the day. And the reporter, of course, he made a number of comments which probably wouldn't win favour with the modern observers. For example, he described how there was such enthusiasm for rugby in Limerick in the lead up to this particular international. And he wrote in his report, even our lady friends show an interest in the game and a knowledge of its technicalities that is, to say the least, surprising. But then he goes on then to mention the role of the ladies in that other famous Limerick sports ground, the Market Field. He says, what indeed would our football carnivals in the Market Field be without the gay assemblage of ladies that invariably grace them? And what would the hard-pressed teams do who have so often been helped on to victory by the waving of kerchief and the cheer of encouragement from their fair admirers in the stand?
Some things never change around here. You can't beat a bit of culture, Matt,
Yes, exactly.
And here we are today recording video casts from there. But to go back to that match, I mean, it was a massive, massive event. 15,000 people attended that match. That match in 1898, and that really set against a backdrop of a game that had really only come to prominence about 10 years or 12 years beforehand in Limerick. And now, albeit this match was organised by, and he gets great mention, John Sullivan, who was the treasurer, I think, of Garryowen Rugby Club at that point.
That's correct. If you think that rugby had really only been set up in an organised fashion in Limerick in the 1870s, and the Munster branch was established in 1879, for example. But I think where one of the factors that resulted in rugby expanding so successfully in Limerick in the 1890s was the temporary eclipse of the GA due to the infighting between different factions, Parnellites versus anti-Parnellites, the Fenians versus the Catholic clergy, and so on. So that definitely allowed rugby to establish itself in Limerick in a manner that it never again was seriously threatened by the GA or by soccer or by any other sport. So this 1898 match, to some degree, you could argue, put the cap. It was a crowning of a decade of very rapid expansion of rugby in Limerick, with the founding, for example, of both Garryowen and Shannon in 1884, for example.
The reports of that game and the coming to Limerick of the teams, it was a massive event for the city. The reports of the Welsh team arriving from Limerick Junction on this saloon train, with fog bangers going off as they came into town.
That's right.
And actually, it put me in mind, the description there put me in mind of only one other event that I've ever seen at the railway station of such significance, and that was the return of the Limerick Hurlers after the 2018 All-Ireland win. They said people were ranged across the front of the station and all the way down Queen Street, which of course is now Davis Street, which has a very interesting story attached to it, as you know as well, because it was renamed Davis Street after the Civil War and our independence, only for it to be found that the Queen that was referred to was actually Mary Queen of Limerick and not the Queen of England.
That's right.
But it was too late at that time.
That's right. That's quite right. Yeah.
But
you're quite right, because sorry, go on.
Yes, sorry, Matt. You go ahead.
No, I'm just again quoting the description. The reporter says the reception of the teams last night was, by the way, a most remarkable event. Sometime before 7 o'clock I became one of the stream of people that flowed towards the railway terminus. That approached the station were lined with people and the crowds extending down Queen Street and the other adjoining thoroughfares. It was with difficulty that one could elbow their way to the entrance to the station, and when there, of course, only a very small percentage could be allowed on the platform. He puts the number at several thousand, and he describes how there was such an enthusiastic crowd. And again, shades of the 2018 event you mentioned. There are a number of important local dignitaries there to welcome them, including the mayor of the time, the High Sheriff. Now, we didn't have one of them in 2018. And then Mr. O'Sullivan of the local rugby grandee, and what were described then as a large number of football devotees. I don't know, were there people that one could describe as devotees in Limerick in 2018? But the language, of course, is wonderful as well. And then it says here then, again, he was lurching into very politically incorrect territory. He says, the Welshmen looked a fine, swarthy lot. So I don't know whether he was, what his particular point was there. But, and again, he mentions then a procession then formed at the station. They were once seated in the 4-horse brake, awaiting, and proceeded to Cruises Royal Hotel, their headquarters. They were accompanied by the Boy Brass Band. Later on, they were given a nice reception on their appearance at the concert in the Theatre Royal. That was in Henry Street at the time. So there's interesting references to lost buildings, lost landmarks of Limerick. Cruises Hotel gone since 1990. The Theatre Royal gone since 1920, you know.
It's also interesting that the Boy Band were good enough to take them down as far as Cruises and to play them out as far as the ground, but it had to be the band of the Royal Irish Regiment which actually played. And this wonderful article, if people want to look it up, which is in the old Limerick Journal of a number of editions ago, and we have to pay tribute to them, of course, for a lot of our source material, as we do to the great Sharon Slater, who on Limerick's Life, who has been absolutely wonderful and has been a great recorder of all things Limerick.
Yes,
but
the details of the program there. It's interesting how elite culture had become very much popular culture at the period. So, for example, the band at the match they began with the overture to the village festival, a selection from Little Christopher Columbus, Reminiscences of Ireland. And then there was what was described as a valse, VALSE, which is a kind of a genteel word for waltz. Svengali was the source of this waltz. That was a very famous show of the period and gives its name, of course, to the modern term Svengali. And then there was a solo from Orfeo. That would be Orfeo in the really say by Gluck. And then there was Kathleen Mavourneen, which was one of the famous operatic pieces of the time from The Lily of Killarney, and a selection from Carmen. And at the very end, God Save the Queen.
And that's quite interesting because there is another mention made in the article where it is mentioned that these two nations played each other, but they weren't two nations.
Oh, yes. The reporter, as I say, he's a wonderful mixture of very fine writing skill and what would now be described as totally inappropriate remarks in that, for example, when the international match between Wales and Ireland came off in the cricket grounds, he says, it seems, by the way, to a layman like myself, somewhat of an anomaly to describe the affair as international, since neither of the contestants can boast of nationhood. But let that pass.
And then he goes on later and he refers to it as the battle between the leeks and the shamrocks, I think. But it just goes to show, I mean, sport has been a uniting factor for people for so long. And that particular ground on that part of the city, and of course so close then as well to the LPYMA grounds. And again, to go back to the geography of Limerick at that time, I mean, there was none of the housing development out there at that point. The North Circular Road, of course, would have been the home very much of the gentry. The whole area, I suppose, out there that it's now got its name from their Coolrain, and the Coolrain estate would have been established out there at that point. And probably the biggest part of what was out there would have been the workhouse at that point, which of course is now St. Camillus'.
That's right. Excuse me, you're quite right in saying that the North Circular Road was full of what at the time would have been described as villas, large detached houses where the mercantile elite, a great many of whom would have been Protestant, of course, were living. The Ennis Road itself would have been developing to some degree the red brick houses, such as the house where Richard Harris grew up, for example, as one approaches the St. Camillus Hospital. Those would have been mainly built in the 1890s, 1900s. So at the time of this rugby international, the area would be in the course of development. But as you went out further to the site of the present Gaelic grounds, for example, that would have been green fields at the period. And of course, when the workhouse was constructed in the 1840s, it was effectively in the countryside. There would have been very little in the way of housing in its vicinity. And that was actually one of the attractions of putting the workhouse in that area because, of course, it was detached from the residential areas of the city, and also land was cheaper, of course, outside of the city, of the built-up area of the city at the time.
We'd better cut to the chase here, Matt, because we're coming up against time. The result of the match?
The result of the match was the final score of Wales, 1 goal off try, 1 penalty goal, 1 try, and that was a total of 11 points, and Ireland, 1 penalty goal, 3 points.
But we had a good time.
We had a good time, yes. I think the best time of all was had by the reporter, who seems to have enjoyed reporting it almost as much as everyone else enjoyed actually attending it.
And he has left us a wonderful account, and I would honestly ask anybody that has a further interest to go and find that article in the Old Limerick Journal. Yeah. Matt, as always, thanks a million. It has been a fantastic, fantastic chat. God bless you.
Thank you so much, then. Thank you.